it's just fundamentally true that there's that counterbalance between, if you want guaranteed buying power accumulation, that comes, of course, at the expense of not being able to mobilize that picks. That comes at the expense of the expected value of your team in the current year.
I think it's important to note that a lot of the time you see and hear in leagues about not wanting a pick that is so far ahead is because what has it done for me lately? Which I think is a big disparity between the teams that want to go all in and the teams that kind of alluded to are the teams that are what we call forever rebuilders. They only want draft picks. They never want players. They just want to make these picks, and that's fine. To me, it's balance. It is acquiring these picks for players that you know for sure you're not getting a 25 or a 26 first for. It's a Cooper Kupp for a 27 first. Would it be nice to have Cooper Kupp on my roster to score points? Absolutely. Is it better long-term to have that draft pick? That's not arguable. Eventually, that will become the case.
What?
Why are you shaking your head? You're welcome.
Today, the first video that we are covering is the 3 currencies of the Dynasty market.
Yeah, so this will be a fun series. We're going to talk a little bit more of the theoretical, the conceptual side of Dynasty, mixing in whatever's happening as we get throughout the season. But specifically for this video today, I want to talk about something that I started a series on market principles of Dynasty about on my Substack, Thinking About Thinking, and that's the 3 currencies of Dynasty. Fundamentally, I believe the value of your roster, and we're going to get back to that term value in a moment, is an aggregate of 3 things, which is current year projected production, draft picks, and then projected production in years beyond this one. So essentially what I call, and this is adopting a term from Adam Harstad, but EYR production, so expected years remaining production. Current production, and really what it is projected production, but we'll call that current production, and draft picks. And the idea of these being the 3 currencies, right? Every asset that you have on your team is either one of these things or some amalgamation of all 3 of those things, right? A 2026 first round pick obviously is one of those things. Travis Kelce is probably the closest example to being almost entirely current year production, right? Going to produce a lot this year. We don't really know what's happening after that. Versus a guy like a Justin Jefferson, going to be really impactful this year, probably going to be really impactful for a very, very long time. While I think we all kind of understand this innately, how we organize our rosters and the moves we make and how we allocate between these 3 different currencies on our roster value, I think actually has a pretty big impact on the types of trades we consider and how we play Dynasty. And that's going to be something we're going to kind of dive into a little bit today and more over the rest of the series.
Buying power versus roster value. Let's get into it.
Yeah, so this is another sort of principle that I've tried to establish is that, and it's semantics, but I think it's important, is that when people always talk about value, right? People are constantly in Dynasty, I like this better for value. I like this better for value. What do people mean by value? And I think most of the time when people say value without any sort of other qualifier, what they mean is they mean market value, right? What something is worth to other people. And what I've tried to do is split up this term value from what I actually refer to that as, which is buying power in my articles. And the reason I've chosen that term is I think it's just fundamentally a little bit more accurate. When we talk about value in a probabilistic game, to me, what we should really be talking about is expected value. The concept of expected value is pretty simple, right? You're given $20. That $20 has a value of $20. It also has an expected value of $20. It's $20. If you're given a coin and someone says, you have a chance to flip this coin. Half the time it lands on heads, half the time it lands on tails. If you get heads, you get $40. If you get tails, you get $0. That coin also has an expected value of $20, right? The average of value that you would get over an infinite sample is what your expected value is. If you have a fantasy team from day one, you don't know what draft position you have, you don't know who your league mates are, you don't know anything else. All you know is the entry fee to that league is $50 and there's no rake. The expected value of your fantasy team that year is $50. To me, when we're talking about these players, we're talking about what is their expected value on our roster. So, what is their contribution to my win equity over a set number of years? Do they have that by creating market value for me, like a draft pick might? Is it going to be by scoring a lot of points right now? Is it going to be by scoring a lot of points for a very long time? It could be any of those kind of three currencies, and they could contribute to the expected value of my roster overall, right? When I think about expected value, I'm thinking about I have a $50 entry league. My team's pretty good. My expected value of that team is about $70 per year, right? I have a bad team. My expected value is about $40 per year. With buying power, it means something specific, and it's not about the value of that player inherently to you in terms of how many points they're going to score. It's purely about what they're worth to other people. And I think separating those two things is key, because how we want to identify players that we want to target ultimately is based on our specific team situation, based on what our needs are. We want to find players where their expected value on our roster exceeds their buying power generally. And we want to sell players that are the inverse of that, where their buying power, what they're worth to others in our league, is probably worth a little bit more than what they're worth to us in our current situation. And we'll get more into, especially around the trade deadline, a lot of trade theory and stuff. But I think that those are two distinct concepts that people often conflate. And I think that ultimately it can have a legitimate impact on how you play.
Obviously, a big part of constructing your dynasty rosters and handling your portfolio is knowing the buying power of draft picks. Jakob, let's dive in.
Probably the thing that I've sort of defined that has gotten the most play in the dynasty market is the idea of the base draft pick, right? And it's this hypothetical pick that doesn't actually exist really in any league that we're in. But it's the idea of a draft pick that could be equally likely to be any spot 1 through 12 that is when we consider it 1 year in the future. And that's how I sort of measure players' values when I rank my tiers, mostly because it's a nice sort of universalized currency. But in my writing and in sort of the practical application, I have what I've called the base value thesis, which is this, right? The first tenet of the base value thesis is that there's a larger difference in value on average between a first overall pick and a mid-draft pick than there is between a mid-draft pick and a late draft pick, which is just pretty much true every single year, right? When we get into rookie draft time and you look at the buying power of the assets, if you look at the ADP of those assets, it makes this kind of curve, right? It's an exponential curve in which the gap between Caleb Williams and Rome Odunze in the market is going to be wider than between Rome Odunze and Brian Thomas in the market. The more information we get then, in theory, the less valuable a draft pick should be if its median is to be in the middle. The reason for that, of course, is the more information we get about these teams, the more certainty we're going to get about which picks are going to be early, which picks are going to be late. We should be more interested in the quote unquote base pick, right? One that could be anywhere, than we should in a mid pick that is probably actually going to be mid, right? Because again, most of the expected value of these draft picks is caught up in those early slots. But we know from our experience anecdotally, that's just not how dynasty markets work, right? You go to your league and you say, hey, I have a 2027 first. It could be anywhere. Or you go to your league and you say, yeah, I have a 2025 first. It's probably going to be between 5 and 8. What do you think is a better chance of buying you a player, right? It's clearly the 2025 first 9 times out of 10, maybe 99 times out of 100. And so why is that? Well, it's because of what I call the hold tax, which is the idea that each year that you hold a draft pick, you are paying off what is the hold tax. This draft pick is appreciating in value solely by it getting closer to being able to convey, right? That 2027 first, its only value to you right now is buying power and draft pick currency, right? Cannot score points for you. The only way it can score points for you is the current buying power that it has, because you go ahead and you trade that for another asset. The closer you get, it becomes more valuable because now you have to eat up less of that holding time, right? If you buy a 2025 pick now versus if you bought a 2025 pick 3 years ago, you're only holding on for 1 year. You don't have to have it sit there on your roster collecting dust, unable to be mobilized into 15 points per game in your lineup. You're just picking it up for the stretch run. You get to then go and pick a player and have fun with it. And that inequity between what should, in theory, in a vacuum, be the more valuable asset versus what actually is the more valuable asset should really underscore what the safest possible way to gain buying power is in Dynasty, which is to have a lot of draft picks. Because if you go out there and you say, I'm willing to pay the whole tax now, I'm going to buy up 2026 picks, I'm going to buy up 2027 picks, inevitably, you're going to be paying the whole tax, which represents what you can't do with that pick in terms of points. But your reward for paying that tax is that you're sitting on a bunch of assets that are going to be worth more in a year, in 2 years, than they're worth today. Maybe next episode, we'll get into, does that mean I should just hoard a bunch of draft picks all the time or not? But it's just fundamentally true that there's that counterbalance between, if you want guaranteed buying power accumulation, that comes, of course, at the expense of not being able to mobilize that picks. That comes at the expense of the expected value of your team in the current year.
I think it's important to note that a lot of the time you see and hear in leagues about not wanting a pick that is so far ahead is because what has it done for me lately? Which I think is a big disparity between the teams that want to go all in and the teams that kind of alluded to are the teams that are what we call forever rebuilders. They only want draft picks. They never want players. They just want to make these picks, and that's fine. To me, it's balance. It is acquiring these picks for players that you know for sure you're not getting a 25 or a 26 first for. It's a Cooper Kupp for a 27 first. Would it be nice to have Cooper Kupp on my roster to score points? Absolutely. Is it better long-term to have that draft pick? That's not arguable. Eventually, that will become the case. It does take a certain type of dynasty player to be able to acquire those picks so far ahead at the expense of points generated on their roster now.
Certainly. So if you were listening today, right, and you're wondering what am I doing tuning into this philosophy class, right? Things that we talked about today, right? 3 currencies in Dynasty: productive value, future production, draft picks. The difference between buying power versus actual value on your roster. And this weird paradox where the less you know about a pick, the more valuable it should be. The closer it is, the more you know, and the more buying power it actually has in the market. What do we do with that? How do we try to balance out our rosters to take advantage of some of these disparities? That's something we're going to get into next week.
That's right. For Thomas Tipple, for Jakob Sanderson, this is your Dynasty Theory Quick Bite. We will see you next week.